I got this idea because I heard a lot about pygmies for other minorities, but not about autistic people. And despite me noticing this being a phenomena for us too, so I finally decided to make this video. I had noticed this since years. My personal definition would be an autistic person acting to please or confirm a neurotypical person's bias, and so also throwing others who are also autistic under the bus. The term pygmy originates in Black culture from the US and gained popularity through Black Twitter in the mid-2010s with the hashtag #TreatLikeAPygmy. It feels a bit bad taking this term and using it for something unrelated, but also by now the pygmy description is used very widely in other areas of social justice, and it just was the most accurate term I could find to describe this. If I find anything that fits better without using this term, I will change the name, and please comment if you have ideas for what this could be. The background footage I use for this video is me colorizing a drawing of Data and Geordi from Star Trek The Next Generation, because Data is an accidental autistic icon with how as an android he had to learn so much and work so hard to understand the social customs everybody else just knew instinctively. A few examples I made in reply about how humiliating and uncomfortable it is to be treated like a child constantly. And to this, another person wrote that he has trouble living alone, so others deciding every single small task for him, and also expenses and activities for him, and talking to him in a baby voice calms him. For the next one, I need to keep it vague because I don't want people to find and harass this person. This was a comment on a list of good and bad examples of autistic representation, saying, but I relate to them about a character neurotypicals tend to hold up as the typical autistic person, but autistic people usually say is quite inaccurate and harmful representation. In one of my fandoms, Shira, I once saw an autistic fan of other characters called Entrapta, chief engineer of the bad guys, who is chaotic and, while caring, not exactly caring in the same way neurotypicals would be, a spoiled woman child, invoking that autistic adults being actually children and autistic people being lazy and burdens, and that we should be grateful for the support we receive. This attitude is also incredibly common in German autistic spaces, probably because, I hate to say it, but we are quite far behind the US in this regard. For example, in a German autism forum, someone wrote that we shouldn't force everybody to change for us because we are the ones who have problems and we are the ones who need to change, which is a scarily common mindset in forums like this. Interestingly, in real life, this doesn't seem to be quite as common, but only just because the autistic people I met there just didn't know anything about the movement at all, and also didn't consider being autistic part of their identity. Now, already a post about the fandom ableism in the Shira fandom brought up someone explaining that it's quite common in the internet for bigots imposing as the minority they want to harm and saying bigoted things to sow distrust. For example, there is this infamous incident where someone wrote that he, as a black man, feels so much safer under President Trump, but the white MAGA fan writing this had forgotten to change his account to an account with a black profile picture, so instead it just showed his own white face. But sadly, most of the time, these bigots aren't quite as easily to spot. The same internet anonymity needed for minorities to truly thrive and be safe on the internet now also makes it difficult to know who truly is autistic and who's just trolling. But I have seen confirmed autistic people do this too, so it's not all fake, sadly. The sad truth is that autistic people are predestined to become pygmies because of how society treats us. Being a pygmy most of all endangers people of the same minority, but usually this starts out as a desperate attempt to appease oppressors or even abusers, which also is the same for other minorities, by the way. But for autistic people, what also adds into this is that the vast majority of therapies is not designed to actually help us, but just to make us behave more palatable for neurotypicals. The most harmful autism therapy that to this day often is the only one health insurances pay for, applied behavioral analysis, has the same roots as gay conversion therapy and is known to cause PTSD. Links below. So early diagnosed people like me are taught from the moment of diagnosis that our emotions are wrong, that we need to be fixed, and that we are only worth something if we benefit or at least don't bother neurotypicals. Luckily, I was too old to get ABA, and I think the therapy I got was at least somewhat helpful for me, but still the clearest memory I have from it is going to the center and feeling that I would just be told how many things I do wrong, that I do everything wrong, and here is how to do it right. You would think that late diagnosed people, from my perception, are the loudest voices in the community, aren't conditioned into this mindset, but for them it just happens through teachers and fellow students and parents instead of therapists. After a few years, this becomes a very ingrained behavior, especially when interacting with neurotypicals. You can't just turn it off even when you realize that it's harmful. It is part of masking and it is incredibly exhausting. But also, if you do this your entire life, you don't know how to do anything else. With this in mind, it makes sense to confirm neurotypicals' harmful misconceptions and pick only the most cliché or palatable parts of your experience as universal. The next three are more in-depth examples in increasing harmfulness. I also use them to show another danger of pygmies beyond just confirming neurotypicals' biases and so working as a shield against neurotypicals, challenging their beliefs and listening to autistics because, well, they're autistic and they confirmed this, so this has to be true. My first example is, how do I call them? Vase. I need to be vague about this too, because I don't want them to be harassed, or, given their much bigger platform, the likelier scenario, I don't want to be harassed. They're a content creator who describes themselves as highly autistic and positions themselves as an authority about autism as well as other social justice topics. They built the largest part of their career from superficially social justice-oriented, condescending commentary on older, not particularly well-known media targeted at girls and women. In isolation, their feminist talking points even appear valid, but in context of all of their content, they are rather used to prop themselves up as being superior and oh so much more progressive than this cringe girl media, and so also make their followers feel like this too. Sad media being so unknown also has the welcome side effect of there just not being much fandom to challenge them, or even their followers knowing this media well and noticing when they misinterpret or misrepresent something. There's a talk to be had about the misogyny in this, but that is not the topic. The topic is how they openly describe what they do as criticizing weird and bad media, which positions bad and weird as being interchangeable, and weird automatically meaning that something needs to be teared down. I find this bewildering from someone highly autistic, because pretty much all the abuse autistic people face does not stem from people knowing that they are autistic, but just from them noticing something that is weird about them and so thinking that means they deserve to be teared down as a person. They also position themselves as superior to these cringe freaks hyperfixating on something as obscure and uncruel as the media they make their content about. In isolation, this wouldn't necessarily make them ableist, but just another arrogant content creator making cheap money by being negative, but with all the other stuff. The scariest part, they managed to fool me for a while by being so confident and framing this as social justice reading. Even as they talked about something mental health related I had experienced but they hadn't, in context of some media not portraying that particularly well, I rather doubted myself because they framed their opinion as objective and platformed people with the same problem who agreed with them. This media made me feel seen and overall helped me, but they fearmongered and white-knighted, saying it was incredibly dangerous and even to blame for people developing this specific mental health issue. Until I felt like my opinion was harmful, my experiences and emotions were wrong, and that I was not a real survivor of that thing, that I was a bad person for liking this media. It took another person who experienced this thing and dissecting Vase's analysis to finally make me realize that they had no idea what they're talking about and were just completely misrepresenting it and only platforming the part of the community of people with this problem who agreed with them. However, and this is the crucial part, Vase's opinion on this is also the opinion the vast majority of neurotypicals end up having. The next bit is not necessarily something that is just about autism, but it does show how Vase positions their own opinion as the only valid opinion and also how their opinion usually aligns with neurotypicals. Vase also claims a heroine with a character arc of feeling wrong and wanting to fit in is too bland and normal to make a plotline like this plausible. They're either purposefully misrepresenting or having not enough media literacy to notice all parts of this story and all parts of the world building that worked into this theme. All of that character's problems stem from a lack of social skills, impulsivity, and trying to fit in at every price, which are not exactly neurotypical behaviors in my opinion. It would be okay if it was just their subjective opinion because they were just not vibing and not connecting with this character, but it is not presented like that. Claiming all characters have to be just like them and fitting their arbitrary standards of being not normal before being allowed to feel othered is truly something. Claiming cringe interests are worthless and fans are pathetic, portraying darker topics in ways neurotypicals don't agree with is disturbing and dangerous enough to be censored, and that you are only valid for feeling like an outsider if you fit some specific standards is definitely harmful. But at least it's just directed at the media, not real people. It still spreads beliefs though, and what if a story written or acted by an autistic person falls into these categories? However, their opinion is always wider spread than the nuanced rebuttals and analysis by people affected and people actually bothering to think deeply about the media, and this is the actual danger. Vase has a skill most autistic people, even other pygmies, don't have. The ability to cater to the mainstream, or at least a sufficiently large subculture group. This is made even worse because at the moment autistic people are too disenfranchised to create a sufficiently large subculture despite being around 1% of the population. Our advocacy movement, even in the US, is at a much earlier stage than, for example, the queer movement, and don't get me started on the German movement, meaning that to get your story or video essay or movie spread as an autistic person, you have to know how to make it appeal either to the mainstream or another subgroup. Which also means that people like Vase have it much, much easier to gain a platform and power than the bulk of autistic people. They end up representing us towards neurotypicals despite their experience only representing a very small part of the autistic experience and them blocking out all other experiences. Of course, there are also some autistic writers, filmmakers, and video essayists who end up becoming famous while truly supporting the community, but you can see that this is incredibly difficult and rare. So what happens if pygmies not just have a superiority complex about something fictional, but actively and deliberately try to harm other autistic people? She-Ra and the Princesses of Power was a Netflix series running from 2018 to 2020, praised for its perfect lesbian representation. But what is lesser talked about is how incredibly bigoted, but in a progressive way, large parts of the fandom were, including some of the most open and twisted ableism I ever saw. I only talk about this briefly because I made 2 whole video essays back when this happened titled Ableism and Fandom Example She-Ra, and I linked them in the description. The most common subject of this ableism is Interrupter, an bisexual autistic woman who ended up becoming the leading engineer of the bad guys, and also her eventual love interest Hordak, who is leader of the bad guys and also has muscular atrophy and quite a lot of religious trauma, though victim blaming and sadism towards other characters is very common too. The main argument against shipping Interrupter and Hordak, and so to keep the mostly autistic and or queer and otherwise disabled shippers from expressing themselves. Interrupter has the mind of a child and can't understand romance or sex, and what Hordak asks her to do, he's manipulating her. They often even straight up call this ship between 2 adults pedophilia. Mind you, Interrupter is 30, spends a significant part of her screen time building weapons of mass destruction, and also ends up being the dominant one in most of her interactions with Hordak. Of course, this is framed as just protecting the oh-so-weak, naive, innocent autistic woman. The same arguments are used to defend the good guys, leashing Interrupter, insulting her, treating her like a small child or an animal, and overall being blatantly ableist to her. But according to them, it is necessary and just to protect her, and they say autistic fans are overreacting. The vast majority of these bullies were neurotypical, but occasionally you saw autistic people agreeing with them. One particularly horrifying incident was an autistic fan outright hunting down other autistic fans for, from their perspective, their wrong opinions, using their platform to encourage harassment, and then claimed they are not ableist because I am autistic. Well, I am autistic, or other minorities too, and I am totally okay with this. Became a very common excuse for clearly bigoted harassment. Neurotypicals, of course, run with this and use this pygmy's opinion as a shield whenever confronted with their bigotry. It was also common for them to send death threats, suicide bait, or even purposefully trying to trigger their victims, which is even grosser since autistic people, thanks to all the abuse and discrimination we go through, tend to have a higher mental illness rate than other groups. And a certain interesting detail was that most autistic fans in the fandom I know had relatively small followings, like under 1,000. But the kind of autistic people who participated in this kind of harassment pretty much always had much bigger following, like several thousand, which for an influencer isn't that much, but in a fandom it definitely is. This is now between 5 and 3 years ago, and I hope these people have learned decency by now. But I have seen some of them happily harass in other fandoms, so probably not. It also shows something already visible in Vase, which is completely ignoring any progressive parts or nuance or opinions other than your own in the media they criticize. They assume that just being part of a minority automatically makes them smarter, more media literate, and most of all, morally flawless. The thought process is basically, I hate this and I'm a minority, and because I'm a minority, my opinion is the objectively white one and the objectively morally perfect one, so this thing is automatically morally flawed or even dangerous or bigoted. They don't understand that there's history and social framework to learn and bigoted assumptions to unlearn. So they conclude that no matter what they do, it will always benefit their community. In Vase's case, this is just overlooking existing neurodivergent and queer and feminist narratives, and so invalidating experiences different from their own secondhand. The harassers in the She-Ra fandom not just directly invalidated, they also attacked these people for being wrong. And if you ever were in fandom spaces or even just leftist activist spaces, you know that this is a problem that is not just in the autistic community. Now the last example, and God, do I wish this was just yet another artist exploiting our minority they are not part of to make Simple Jack a reality. For those lucky enough to not have seen this, here a quick summary, since others have talked and written about this in more depth than I can. A few years ago, singer Sia released a movie called Music, using a non-verbal autistic girl as a prop for her music videos, played by her, not autistic, favorite teen actress. If you want to realize the level of ableist this movie is, I saw one still from it, showing the teen actress make an exaggerated overbite and a stupid rapid expression, and felt self-conscious about my own expressions for days. It also shows restraining an autistic person who has a meltdown as a sensible thing when in real life this had ended up killing people. The discrimination someone like this girl would face is totally glossed over, while also presenting the main character as a burden to everybody around her and only considering the feelings of her caretakers as important. Sia then proceeded to harass and chase her followers on autistic people criticizing this or why she had cast a neurotypical as an autistic person, to which she claimed autistic actors couldn't handle it. Sia temporarily left Twitter, but don't worry, she never faced any actual consequences. Her career is still going strong. I even heard one of her songs on the radio recently. She came out as autistic in 2022, said her mental health suffered from all of this, and tried to pretend she was the victim. Of course, prominent neurotypicals like the comedian Katie Griffin then choose to listen to Sia and not the community because, well, she's autistic, right? It doesn't come across as remorse or even understanding how harmful and bigoted the movie is, at best using her new diagnosis to deflect. Sadly, I do have to admit that Sia has talent, but I'm also absolutely sure that there are dozens of equally or even more talented autistic people who never got the chance to be this famous because they can't mask this well and be endearingly quirky instead of off-puttingly weird, and are able to pander to the mainstream. All these examples show is, while all pygmies have potential to harm others, pygmies who are good at it are especially dangerous. I already talked about how much easier they gain power and so shape the mainstream's view, and how they are used as a shield against having to examine your own bigotry. But what makes it even worse, thanks to the average autistic person not being able to gain respect from so many people, there is quite a power imbalance. It is impossible to get them to correct their mistakes, reconsider, or even just get consequences for their actions. I tried. At best, everybody ignores you. At worst, you get negative consequences from it, namely being dogpiled by them and/or their massive follower bases. Not going to lie, it feels awful to watch them spread their drivel and know that I can do absolutely nothing about it. And it gets worse. We also need to talk about hate groups preying on autistic people's isolation and their on average stricter sense of moral. I only go into this briefly because there are better wits by other people and it's not my area of expertise, but this needed mention. I'm going to talk about the two I noticed the most, which definitely aren't the only ones. First, of course, are incels. If you were lucky enough to never have heard of them, incels are men, mostly young and white, and exclusively cishet, blaming their inability to attract women not on patriarchy working against them if they fall outside the mold just the slightest bit, their overblown expectations, their entitlement to the point of rape, and their other abusive behavior, but women and especially feminism. Women are seen as objects and so inherently lower and inherently alien. At this point they have multiple murders and even mass murders linked to them. Why did they end up preying on autistic people? Being autistic makes it much harder to use all these million small things you need to flirt and which nobody ever explains to you. From my experience, flirting with men is also much easier than flirting with women because women are socialized to behave subtler, more ambitious and passive. Also, being autistic usually makes it harder to coordinate your body, especially in sports, and often also leads to boys having trouble instinctively getting typical male behaviors right. Given how status among men and boys quite often relies on these things, it is obvious how autistic men can end up feeling like they're failing their masculinity. Incels then come in, ignoring the patriarchal and ableist systems that othered them in the first place, but offer them a purpose and someone to blame. Always still demonizing these autistic traits, needing to overcome them by abusive pick-up artistry and bizarre uber-masculine behavior. So they are also actively upholding these systems of power. It is hard for me to feel empathy with someone this vile, but it is an insidious system. A creepy detail about hate groups. It is in their best interest to uphold oppressive systems that other members because it makes them desperate enough to get trapped and drives new followers to them. The other hate group shares incels' inability to call women women, calling them females instead, and their tendency to reduce women down to walking reproductive organs. Trans-exclusive radical feminists, aka TERFs, aka gender-critical, aka hygienic, or whatever other Nazi dog whistles they use now, originated in the second-wave feminism between the 60s and 80s. In my opinion, this name is misleading since they are neither feminists nor radical in anything but their hate crimes. They do claim to be feminist, often trying to lure new people in by taking out of context sensible actual feminist analysis of issues and reinterpreting them for their ideology. But they're hardly ever actually helping women. They use their danger for women to justify hate crimes, usually, but by far not limited to trans people. If you look closely, you see that the majority of people they are harassing are women who don't fit into their narrow ideals of how a woman has to look like. And not just trans women, by the way. They even cooperated with fascist anti-women groups in hopes to harm minorities they claim are a danger to women. Their ideology boils down to gender being inherent, and so the exact same thing as sex. Unchangeable, neither by cultural nor biological means, and solely based on the gender assigned at birth. According to them, men are always stronger, domineering, abusive, and unable to control their sex drive, and women are always pure, innocent, weak, unable to do any harm, and have no sex drive. If that sounds like Western patriarchal bullshit, that's because it is. From that follows that every group seen as men, or even just tainted by men, is a danger to those oh so pure, helpless women. This includes trans women, obviously, trans men, non-binary people, bisexual women, asexual or aromantic women. This is an interesting case because their danger is seen in challenging the usually cis lesbian or cishet TERF space as the biggest victim ever. Poly women, women of color, they have specifically white womanhood ideals, so they are automatically seen as traitors. Disabled women and neurodivergent women. Sorry for being so furious about this, but they have adopted this tactic to use fandoms to spread their ideology, especially in fem/fandoms, so that by now most of it is widely accepted there, which has seriously harmed me as a bisexual, gender non-conforming, autistic woman. Relevant for this video, TERFs have a tactic of recruiting all the minorities they do hate speech against, except for trans women, to use as a shield when called out on their bigotry. Their hatred of autistic people is not as clear-cut as for other minorities. They believe that autistic women, or everybody they think are autistic women, are childlike and should not be allowed to make choices. We are seen as too incompetent to know our own gender and are preyed on by the evil transgender, like J.K. Rowling so openly said. Additionally to this, neurodivergence with all the unusual behavior, different clothes and gender expression, and outside view on all these systems of power can quite easily be seen as gender traitors. And still, you ever so often have the pleasure to come across an openly autistic TERF. Sadly, it does make sense given how hate groups prey on isolation. They promise a sense of belonging, we against them, and like for insults, autistic women face discrimination based on failing your gender, and this hate group now claims to have solutions. There is a sense of power in abusing others. Now you are one of the good ones and saving autistic women, aka trans men. Also, there are many autistic people in fandom, and with TERFs massively using fandom for indoctrination since 10 or so years, it would make sense that a few of these end up in their hate group. What always gets me about these kind of autistic people and hate groups is that the moment they stray outside the extremely narrow gendered ideals or behave wrong in any other small way, they will directly be discarded. They will be seen as just as worthless as all the autistic people not in the hate group. And it's hard to believe that they don't know this in some way. And still they decide to go against people who truly could have respected them, people who are like them. But I guess it feels better to believe you are this just crusader instead of just some isolated pawn preyed on by a hate group. At the end, I think it's also important to talk about the dangers of this pick-me autistic concept. After all, not like other girls went from a critique of reducing others to sexist stereotypes to uplift yourself to labeling minorities genuinely suffering because they are not like most other girls in their classes or job or whatever, or even just girls who don't fit into the current femininity ideal. A very wide range of autistic experiences exists. What might come across as exaggerated and cliché might be reality for others. For example, intellectually disabled autistics. Unlike what neurotypicals tend to believe, most autistic people are not intellectually disabled, but they do exist and we need to share their experiences as well, especially since it's even more often talked over. Not every autistic person disagreeing with you or even being a total asshole is automatically a pick-me. And not every autistic person in positions of power is automatically one either. Though sadly, with how all of these systems, especially social media, are set up, it is much more likely. We need to avoid falling into a us versus them mentality. Neurotypicals are not inherently evil, they just have more societal power, and for most of them society never taught them how to treat us. They are also not a monolith. It is strange to me that I haven't seen this talked about elsewhere, because I encounter this phenomenon so often in social media, but also in real-life groups or even in books written by autistic people. It is important that we also watch out for pick-me tendencies in ourselves. We are not immune to bigotry or internalizing harmful things, and especially as an autistic person, you are basically trained to conform. I wish I had more solutions, especially for this issue of pick-me's gaining huge platforms and then talking over the rest of us. We probably just need to be aware of this problem. I truly hope others manage to come up with solutions, though.